Queen Eleanor, independent spirit of the medieval world. Introduction: Eleanor and the 12th century. For the first time in over 200 years, the great Duchy of Aquitaine was without a male heir. The long line of Duke Williams came abruptly to an end in 1137 when the 10th Duke William died, leaving his vast landholdings, 1/4 the extent of modern France, to his young daughter Eleanor. This book is the story of Eleanor's life, which spans most of the 12th century, the very peak of the Middle Ages. Though it was a time when women had no equal rights and little or no power, Eleanor became one of the most influential leaders and was involved in all the great events of her era. She was the key figure in an endless quarrel between the French and English kings. At times she ruled like a king herself and dealt with emperors and popes. More important, she won respect for women and made gentlemen of crude warrior knights. Her independent, outspoken nature made enemies among conservatives who did their best to blacken her reputation. But Eleanor had the courage to uphold her convictions. Eleanor could trace her ancestors back to the time of Charlemagne, the emperor who had united Western Europe under one strong government 3 centuries earlier. Charlemagne had brought order out of the chaos of the Dark Ages, and had enveloped Europe since the collapse of the Roman Empire and the wild confusion set in motion by wave after wave of barbarian invasions. Unfortunately, Charlemagne's great empire did not long survive his death. Under his weak descendants, it broke up into a jumble of little kingdoms, duchies, and countries. New invaders, Huns from the east, Muslims from the south, and the terrifying Viking pirates from the north, took advantage of these weak states and plunged the West once more into anarchy. Charlemagne's civilizing progress was set back as lawlessness and fighting became the order of the day. The most destructive invaders of all, the Vikings, looted and killed without mercy. They spared neither church nor monastery, neither women nor children. "From the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, O Lord," prayed the terrified people. Many believed the dire prediction that the world was coming to an end in precisely the year 1000. But the year 1000 came and went, and the world was still here. The invasions gradually abated. By the 11th century, Europe was well on the road to recovery. The Northmen had become farmers and settled in Normandy. The Huns had been driven east. The Muslims in Spain, known as Moors, had begun to spread their highly developed culture to the Spanish Christians. When Eleanor was born in 1122, new forces for a more civilized way of life had begun to stir. Though there was still no unified government in Western Europe, there was one bond that united society: the Christian faith. Almost everyone was a Catholic. Christian fervor was at its height and was to inspire a whole new church architecture, the soaring Gothic cathedral built to the glory of God. Men and women went on long pilgrimages to distant shrines of saints and holy martyrs. Christianity also inspired the mail-clad knights, constantly fighting each other to get more land or to keep what land they had, or just for sport, to unite as soldiers of the Lord and wage so-called holy wars or crusades against the Muslims. While the crusades did little for the Christian cause, they did open up trade with the wealthy Near East, and contact with the more civilized and educated Muslims aroused a new interest in learning, the arts, and a taste for luxury among the Western Christians. The West shook off its semi-barbaric past and began to live in a little more comfort and confinement. Scholars traveled long distances to find teachers and books. People outside the church began to read. Lyric poetry and romances about King Arthur expressed new ideals of chivalry. In all these beginnings, Eleanor played an important part. As we live in a democratic society, Eleanor lived in what is called a feudal society. Though feudalism had begun in the Dark Ages before Charlemagne, it quickened and widened its grip on society after the breakup of his empire. During the new invasions, when people thought only of their own security, kings were too weak to defend their little kingdoms, and the fear-stricken people sought protection from the nearest strongman. A nearby armed knight was more powerful than a faraway weak king. Peasants flocked to the nearest local lord and took refuge in his stronghold, willingly surrendering their freedom and promising to provide their lord with a share of crops and other necessities of life in exchange for protection. This contract between the weak and the strong was the basis of the feudal system under which people lived for centuries. The weaker and poorer became his lord's sworn follower or vassal, promising loyalty and service during his lifetime. By the 12th century, every member of society owed service to someone higher up, peasant to baron, baron to count, count to duke, and finally duke to king, the only one without an overlord. Though the king at the top of the pyramid was supposed to be the real ruler, that was not always so. The man with the most vassals, the wealthy vassals, those who could afford horse and armor, were the powerful knights. And the most land was often more powerful than the king. Such was the case when Eleanor was born. Her father, Duke William X of Aquitaine, owned more land, had more vassals, and was more powerful than the King of France, Louis VI, better known as Louis the Fat.